Hi everyone, welcome to our final mini lecture, Final Thoughts, Gender and Power Revisited. We hope you've enjoyed this class as much as we've enjoyed teaching it. I can't believe we're already at the end. This PowerPoint and mini lecture is to give you some of our concluding thoughts now that we've had 8 weeks to think about, read about, and talk about concepts of gender and violence. So to start, the key takeaways that I'd like you to get from this class, first and foremost, is that the meaning of both gender and violence are socially constructed ideas that are also contested. In our earliest readings, we read from Nancy Shepherd Hughes and Philippe Bourgois' paper and looked at the ways violence in and of itself is a socially constructed idea. They said that violence doesn't often have a checklist. It's not a quote it that we can easily define. It's often embedded in systems and structures that are in themselves the factors that lead to conflict and violence, whereas oftentimes we have this misplaced notion that violence is something clear cut, as Todd Akin put it, that has a forcible, legitimate element to it, when oftentimes it can be the soft, quiet, what Nancy Shepherd Hughes calls the everyday genocides of marginalization and disenfranchisement. Gender also is a socially constructed idea. The ways in which we understand what gender is and how we perform it are rooted in our cultural and historical concepts of the ways in which men and women interact and the ways in which masculinity and femininity is embodied by individuals. Gender is intrinsically intertwined with these social systems of power. The ways in which gender influences our understanding of society influences the ways in which we view legitimacy and social status in our cultures. So gender is truly influential in defining who has social power, who's denied social power, and how power is achieved and maintained. The other key takeaways we'd like you to walk away from the course with is specifically related to gender-based violence. Gender-based violence has been a critical framework for authorizing intervention into women's lives and societies who are engaging in active conflict. But this framework often fails to address the structural implications of gender on the ways in which societies form the ways in which societies are themselves formed and how they function. So we talked a lot in this course about the influence of gender on power in societies, and to ignore the ways in which gender fundamentally structures power in societies negates or makes invisible the ways in which we think about power and conflict. So if we're just thinking about gender-based violence as something that happens to women as opposed to something that happens as a result of the ways in which power is structured in society, we're never going to be able to move past thinking about the outcomes of conflict and begin to address the root causes. The ways in which we're framing gender-based violence all too often place the onus on individual women to transcend structurally violent institutions and cultural norms, rather than placing pressure to transform the actual problematic institutions that lead to gender-based violence. So we have some key takeaway suggestions that we'd like to move forward through this lecture with, to give you just some ideas of where our thinking is, and we look forward to discussing, hopefully as the class comes to an end, we'll have the opportunity to continue these discussions. We'd like to discuss with you where your thinking is, and we look forward to reading your final papers to gain an understanding of how you've begun to reframe your own definitions of gender-based violence. But here's our key takeaways. First off, we think that there's a need for theoretical frameworks and practical policies that conceptualize gender-based violence as violence perpetuated to uphold, manipulate, or undermine the status quo gender regime. This is going to place the emphasis on the ways in which gender influences the formation and functioning of social systems and move us away from thinking about gender-based violence as something that's rooted in the actions of individuals within structural violence systems. We want to move away from analysis of individual actors and move towards an analysis that understands the ways in which culturally and historically rooted definitions of gender-based violence influence the ways in which people think about violence and make gendered violence such a useful tool in the context of war. We have a few practical steps for moving forward. Our first recommendation is to look to the power players. We want to ask Who benefits? The Latin phrase "cui bono" is actually a really useful one here. It's tossing around. It means as benefit to who. When we're assessing the dominant players in any given context or conflict, we need to start by asking who's benefiting from the conflict. Who are the power players and what are they getting out of the ways in which this conflict is being framed? The common theme among literature on gender based violence is the attention to victims, and this overlooks the people and institutions who benefit from gendered violence. Greater attention to the constructs of power and conflict is a necessary starting point for approaching richer conceptualizations of gender and gender based violence. Without such shift in attention, interventions are going to continue to be developed from a standpoint of addressing outcomes rather than addressing causes. Asking who benefits as a first question in analysis of gendered violence will shift our analysis towards power mechanisms that make gender based violence an effective and, unfortunately, thus attractive tactic in conflict. The next practical step we'd like to suggest in moving forward is assessing the meaning of masculinity. The overwhelming attention right now in studies of gender and gendered violence is focused on women. This, however, before we get into critiquing it, let's note that this marks progress in the field of of conflict analysis and resolution, as well as human society overall. After all, in the not so distant past, crimes against women in war weren't considered part of political cost of conflict, and they were deemed as the inevitable natural conflict consequence of war. However, this attention must be viewed as a stepping stone on the path to greater progress on gendered conflict, not an ending point. Right now, researchers and practitioners need to expand the analytical lenses we use to include assessments of the ways masculinity is constructed, understood, and embodied within the societies we choose to work. This is a necessary starting point for beginning to pay greater attention to the power systems that undergird conflicts that we are choosing to address through our practice or study. Additionally, it's a vital precursor to understanding intersections of race and gender and power that we talked about in our week 2 of this course. The reading that we had from Connell talks about delineating hierarchies of gender. This calls attention to the ways in which race, ethnicity, and sexuality can be used to marginalize privileged actors. Applying these theoretical delineations in our assessments of conflict will move us towards a greater understanding of the power dynamics at play and help us to develop better interventions for addressing violence. Our final practical recommendation is to let the marginalized voices of women and men from conflicts tell the story of what it means to have what gendered violence means. Analyzing gendered violence from the perspective of marginalized actors means that we ground our understandings of what gender and violence are from the perspectives of those who have experienced it rather than coming in with preconceived notions of what gender and violence are in a given context. We've spent a great deal of time in this class focusing on the need to shift from assessments of marginalized actors to focus on power and privilege, so it might seem counterintuitive that we go back to this point and talk about the need to understand where marginalized actors are coming from. We do this because we think the field has overlooked the implications of history from the perspective of those without power when addressing gender dynamics of conflict. Much of the literature we've talked about in this class focuses on gender in a historical vacuum of sorts. Emphasis needs to be given to listening to women's voices, but much of the listening that's been done in the past studies of gender and conflict has been done without considering the ways in which historical narratives, transnational pressures, and past conflicts have influenced the present constructions of gender and the constraints that these place on individual actors. When we place greater emphasis on analyzing the ways in which history and globalized economies are constraining marginalized actors, we may be able to yield greater insights into the power dynamics at play in different conflicts. So to give some final thoughts in conclusion here, we want to move towards an understanding of gendered and violence that violence that perpetuated against men and women is done because it undermines the status quo gender regime, not just because women are an easy target or that targeting men goes against the gendered norms. We're looking at the ways in which these different actions actually undermine the ways in which we understand how our societies function. Reframing gendered violence to understand the nuanced ways in which violence and social constructions of gender play out is sorely needed. This shift in framing will move scholars and practitioners towards an understanding of gender-based violence as violence perpetuated for the sake of reifying gendered dominance or violence that leverages gendered norms to humiliate, traumatize, or undermine the social order. Recognizing gender-based violence as violence that manipulates, undermines, or obliterates cultural norms to inflict harm shifts attention away from particular groups affected by violence or violence of a sexual nature, and instead queries the ways in which cultural norms make particular forms of violence so effective. So, to give just a few examples of this, in the Rwandan genocide and in the ongoing conflict in the DRC, fathers and sons were often forced to rape their daughters and mothers. In Bosnia, male prisoners were forced to bite off the testicles of other male prisoners. These actions were traumatizing not just because of the direct violence that took place, but because of the gendered social norms that the victims were forced to violate. As noted by many of the scholars that we've read, rape is an assault not just against the victim, but also against the family and community. In the case of sexual violence that transgresses the gendered norms of familial or social institutions, including heteronormative standards, the disastrous effects on the social order is rendered more effective. Conceptualizing gendered violence as violence that manipulates, leverages, or undermines such norms holds promise for richer theories with the potential to design more effective interventions, post-conflict programs, and justice mechanisms that provide recourse for male and LGBTQ victims, as well as women victims that we've begun to focus on in the aftermath of Security Resolution 1325. So those are our concluding thoughts for the class. Thank you all for the hard work that you've done, the passion that you've poured into your discussions, and all of the different ways that you've influenced our thinking on gendered violence. We hope you've enjoyed the course and appreciate all that you did. Thank you so much.